So welcome everybody. My name is Silvia Di Blasio and I am the e-learning and academic coordinator at Gaia Education. And I want to welcome all of you today to this webinar. So Gaia Education is, the mission of Gaia Education is being a leading edge provider of sustainability education that promotes thriving communities within planetary boundaries. At Gaia Education, we base all our curriculum on 4 pillars of sustainability, which are the social, worldview, economic, and ecological aspects. And they are all designed from the whole systems perspective. We have presence in many different parts of the world. Many participants are coming from different countries. We have served in all these years, since 2005, 26,000 people from all over the world. Our main program is called the GETS, which is the Gaia Education Design for Sustainability. And for all of you who have registered to this webinar, you will have a special 50% discount for this program in case you want to take it. And today I'm inviting you to attend this webinar as a very, very interesting webinar that brings together 2 people, Fritjof Capra from System Thinking and System Change, which is the interaction between Fritjof Capra and leadership with Monica Sharma. So I'm going to stop here. And I'm going to pass to, I think it's you, Shakti. Oh, Sudarshan, sorry.
Sudarshan, correct.
Thank you, Sylvia. Welcome, everybody. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon, depending on where in the world you are. So my name is Sudarshan, and I care about freedom, harmony, and justice for myself and for everybody and all living beings on this planet. RTL Works is one of the many groups in a constellation, actually, promoting radical transformational leadership to make ethical leadership a global movement. And through fostering individual and organizations that become change agents to shift systems and culture, sourcing our humanity's and human beings' greatest assets, our inner potential and our individual agency. And we are committed to achieving the sustainable development goals and would like to be a pioneer and a role model as a next generation social purpose enterprise that is an investor and invested in equitable results based on universal values. So we are a constellation of independent and interdependent individuals and organizations that use RTL tools and templates, including the conscious full spectrum response model, which you will hear about, which is the triple helix of our innate human attributes, the universal heart of compassion, equity, dignity, impulse, our discerning eye that can see patterns for solving problems, shifting culture, and sourcing our inner power. So without further ado, I will hand it over to Shakti, who's going to anchor our conversation with Monica, Fritjof, and the next leg of our webinar, the first leg of our webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Sudarshan. Good day, good evening to all of you, depending on which part of the world you reside in. My name is Shakti, and I stand for oneness with humanity and harmony with nature. Thank you all for joining our session today on systemic thinking and transformative leadership. I'm happy to present my 2 teachers to you, Monica Sharma and Fritjof Capra. Monica and Fritjof, I'm indeed really very honored to have you both together on this webinar. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this event. A key message that I wish to share with all of you is that one is never too old to learn. This happened in Jan 2018. I was transitioning from the corporate sector to the social sector and was attending a 1.5-day-long workshop on radical transformation leadership, change conducted by both Sudarshan Rodrigues and Suparna Divakar, a co-founder of the Indian School of Development Management. This workshop introduced me to systems thinking in the social sciences. And prior to this, my understanding of systems was pretty much limited to information technology systems, financial systems, risk management systems. So intriguing was their session that it led me to enroll in the full version of Monica's 9-day leadership program later that year. A year and a half later, down the road, my Brazilian colleague, Fernando Ska, urged me to attend a webinar by Fritjof, who was speaking on saving the system's view of life. We were barely 3 months into the pandemic, and I was astounded by the clarity that Fritjof had to offer on his assessment of COVID-19. That was also when I first heard of the Capra course, and I wasted no time in signing up. I'd like to place on record my sincere thanks to Mira Michelle Kennedy, a former Capra course admin. If it weren't for my discovery that Mira had participated in Monica's programs, we may not be having this webinar today. Also, I'd like to express my gratitude to Shomita Kundu, Lisinka Olotoska, and Pragati Sani for their insights and for graciously allowing me to use them as sounding boards. Of course, many thanks to Sylvia Di Blasio and Della Duncan, who both double hat with Gaia Education and Capra course, and to Sudarshan of RTL Works and Suparna Divakar, who I discovered quite recently to be a Capra course alum. What we're going to do today is to have Fritjof and Monica each present a summary of their work. This will be followed by a moderated discussion that I will lead. And we will then take audience questions before we conclude and wrap up. You will observe in today's webinar that both Monica and Fritjof's work are very complementary. I'm now going to invite Fritjof and Monica to spend 10 minutes each sharing a summary of their decades-long work. Over to you, Fritjof. You go first.
Okay, thank you very much, Shakti. It's a great pleasure for me to participate in this webinar with people from all over the world. So let me begin with the big picture. When we look at the state of the world today, at our multifaceted global crisis, what is most evident is that none of our major problems, energy, environment, the climate emergency, economic inequality, and now the COVID pandemic, none of these problems can be understood and solved in isolation. They are systemic problems, which means that they're all interdependent and interconnected. To understand and solve them, we need to learn how to think systemically, which means thinking in terms of relationships, in terms of patterns, in terms of context. And indeed, such a systemic understanding of life has recently emerged at the forefront of science. And this is what my work is all about. Over the last few decades, I developed a synthesis of this new understanding of life, which I call the systems view of life. Now, you may have heard about systems thinking before. It has been taught by a number of organizational theorists and consultants for several decades. However, what I'm presenting in my books and in my online course is quite different. Their frameworks generally are based on the classical systems theories of the 1940s. My synthesis, by contrast, embodies what I've come to call advanced systems thinking. There is a conceptual watershed between the classical and the advanced systems thinking. The key difference is that advanced systems thinking is formulated in terms of concepts derived from complexity theory, which was developed in the 1970s and 1980s. Now, you will appreciate that such a synthesis involves quite a few technical terms, but recently I have found a completely non-technical way of summarizing it. And I do so in terms of 4 essential characteristics of life, which can be observed at all levels of complexity. from the smallest bacteria through the wide range of plants, animals, human beings, social systems, ecosystems, and so on. So 4 essential characteristics. The first, life organizes itself in networks. This actually contains 2 ideas. One is that the network is the basic pattern of organization of all living systems. And 2, that life organizes itself. In other words, the network pattern is not imposed by the environment, but is created by the system itself. The second characteristic is that life is inherently regenerative. Now, the continual regeneration of life in nature is ancient knowledge. You just have to think of the turn of the seasons with new growth in every spring, continual regeneration. What is new in the system's view is the observation that this regeneration operates at all levels of complexity, down to the molecular networks of cells. Regeneration is the very essence of life's self-organization. When regeneration stops, life stops. The third characteristic is that life is inherently creative. And this is really something radically new that scientists have observed and discovered only very recently. I'm talking here about a particular process known as emergence, the spontaneous emergence of new order at critical points of instability. This is characteristic of all living systems, and it expresses the creativity inherent in all life. So we are not creative because we may be poets, artists, or designers. We are not even creative because we're human. We are creative because we are alive, because life itself is creative. And finally, the fourth characteristic is that life is inherently intelligent. And this is connected with a new concept of cognition, or if you wish, of mind, that was developed in the last few decades. This is a complex new concept. To summarize it, I would say the interactions of a living system with its environment are not an automatic response, but are directed by the system itself according to its nature and according to past experience. And this is why these interactions are identified as cognitive or intelligent. So in my synthesis, I weave these ideas, each of them radical and full of important implications, into a coherent conceptual framework. As I have mentioned, this systemic understanding of life is urgently needed today to solve our major global problems. However, the conceptual framework is not the whole story. If it were, we would have persuaded our political and corporate leaders long ago to help us build a sustainable future. Just think that right now we are witnessing exceptional heat waves, droughts all around the world, with millions of dollars of losses in agriculture and other areas. We are witnessing tremendous floods, in more intense hurricanes, and these are all phenomena, events that were predicted by climate scientists already about 30 years ago. Now, you will know that in the United States, the American Congress last week passed significant climate legislation, which is great to know. However, half of the Senate voted against this legislation. Now, these senators are not stupid, but they are immoral. So we need to talk about morality, we need to talk about ethics, we need to talk about personal transformation, about inner development. And this is what Monica Sharma's work is about. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Monica.
Thank you, Fritjof, and thank you, Shakti. And thank you for being here. Fritjof, yes, the issue is, how do we take what we know and make that into reality? Because the turbulent times have happened because of decisions we've made. So what will it take for us to look at the decisions that were made? Some of these decisions were made without knowing the consequences of what will happen. But many of them were made knowing what will happen, and therefore the ethical dimension. The biggest question really is, when we know that a decision that was made, never mind from what basis, is not working, what is it in us that we cannot transform it? What is it in us that we do not get together individually and collectively to move beyond those decisions? People on this planet living way, way below what anybody would like to live and how they would like to live. And yet it's a world of abundance. How are we going to deal with it? So this work is about mobilizing the best of all sectors. And the work has been pre-tested in countries around the world. When I worked on large-scale programs like the HIV/AIDS epidemic, the maternal mortality reduction space, spaces that had to do with education, conservation. So it is a space that can work interdependently. Doesn't matter how you enter that space. So Fritjof's work on systems thinking is not just conceptual, it's about systems change. And I take it to the step that he talked about. So what's missing in leadership programs today? There's a great recognition that there's an inner space we need to develop. There's recognition that the outer world needs to change. The outer world is measurable. The inner space is not. It's an emergent space. But there's a space in between, the space that most leadership programs choose not to look at, what Fritjof has looked at, which is the changes that are largely challenging status quo, the changes that have to be made in the formal system, the changes that have to be made in cultural norms. So when a Senate decides not to promote what is required for their own grandchildren, cannot see beyond the next 10 years and the vested interests that exist, then there is something we need to shift. It's something we need to shift. So the work that I do to make it to make it accessible is just 3 words: radical, transformational, leadership. So let me begin with radical. So the word radical is used as radicalize, like politically, that's what works. But that's not how I mean it. I mean it the way the Oxford Dictionary defines it, which is the source, the foundation of anything. So the radical side is who I am being. And why did I use the word radical, which is the root of my being? Because this work is not about incremental change, tinkering in the margins. It's about a space where we radically transform what's required for people and planet. Not because somebody else tells us to do it, because we touch that space ourselves. And therefore, it's an emergent space. We cannot dictate to anybody, whether that's a grassroots worker, a policymaker, a scientist, a social worker, it doesn't matter. This work is not about propaganda. It's not about indoctrination. It's not about justifying it. It's about, of course, information based on science. But if information changed decisions, we would be somewhere else today. So it's about the radical you and the radical Fritjof and the radical me and the radical Shakti or Sylvia or Sudarshan. It's about that dimension that we really care about. So I really care about freedom as deep liberation of who I am, about equity, about dignity for everyone, for myself. And so what the good news is that evidence shows that actually the beautiful dimension of human beings, work done by Daniel Goleman, that shows that actually self-esteem matters to us, self-awareness matters to us, that we have a choice to deepen ourselves. We have studies done by Oxfam in the US. For example, 92% of people actually believe in fairness. Then what's happened with our media, our education, our information, that these 92% of people are not expressing equity, which is the social dimension of fairness. We also know through tradition of thousands of years that there is a depth in us that is extremely strong, more than empathy, more than love. We call it compassion, karuna. Every language has a word for it. It is that strong space. When you see anything that's not working, you stand up and act. When I see something not working, my compassionate self acts. Justice without compassion is harsh. Justice with compassion is progress and emergence. So I'll thread these things together. When I thread it together, I say, you are, I am a contemporary pioneer. Why are you and I contemporary pioneers? Because we begin where Fritjof ended, the ethical self, the knowing. That's why we are pioneers, because it hasn't been a movement so far. It's going to be a movement. The second dimension of radical transformational leadership, and I'm threading it again together, is activating your mind beyond your heart. And your mind, the critical mind, the intelligent mind that we are speaking of, has a way of processing, viewing, seeing things differently when it emanates beyond ideology and it emanates from this radical self. That space can be stimulated. We have in society actually made sure that it's not stimulated. We have theories like, systems thinking and change is only about experts. No, it's about everyone. So that's what we know. It's about everyone. And so did Donella Meadows say that. So this is not about just inner space and outer space. It's the space that we choose not to focus on in leadership programs. And indeed, in the conversations we are having. We had this movement, gross national happiness, and we wanted to look at an alternative to just service delivery. but it became something different. Today, we are talking of inner development goals, of course, but those goals are not isolated from work. It's about systems change. So why aren't we saying inner development goals for systems change? Because then we have to manifest courage. Then we have to challenge status quo. And to me, that brings us to the word transformation. Transformation is used by everybody. Every politician, grassroots workers. What Fritjof and I mean, and I'm Fritjof because we've had a few conversations, so I know that you and I are on the same page. It's about equity. It's about being fair, whether that has to do with the planet or ourselves. So transformational leadership is about transforming the form that is beyond what is today. And that form is based on equity, and it's based on enduring change. How does enduring change happen? Enduring change happens from emergence. It doesn't happen from compliance. It doesn't happen from another place. And so the emergent self emerges from our unique attributes. And that emergent self is about systems change. Too many of us talk about theory. RTL, or Radical Transformational Leadership, is about practice. So if I am about theory and practice, I need to design differently. Am I an architect? You know, all these log frames we use and planning tools and techniques. There are thousands of consultants and thousands of tools, all of them logical, linear reductions. And how are we going to transform the way in which we design for change? Because if we don't design differently, we will deliver what we've designed. Inequity exists because we've designed it that way. If we flatten the playing field today completely in 3 months, the pyramid of inequity will come forward. So then you are the unifying architect. Those are the tools and templates we use. How do you design in a manner that unfolds the full potential of everyone and is a force for unifying ourselves rather than the fragmented worlds that we live in? And the last but not the least is leadership. This leadership is not the typical hierarchical leadership. It's your choice to make a new future at home, in your workplace, in society. It's my choice. And what we've seen, we have roughly data from about 40 million people that shows that they transformed. But in a planet with billions, we have a long way to go. That will be enduring change. That will be emergence. And it will be self-organizing. It's not built on somebody else organizing the constellations and networks. Lastly, I threaded as the word conscious, the outer circle, the space, the outer circle, the outer being, who I am. But it's not an outer being. It's my inner being manifesting outside. And then the systems dimension and the cultural norms that must be changed. I have many stories, but that's for another time. And this is the fractal. What's a fractal? It's a pattern. So suddenly I don't have to be a billionaire. I can do this work anywhere I am. And I can do it because I am part of that movement. So as an individual, I am that fractal that sources my inner capacity, my universal values, that thinks, changes systems. And I am that person that has the courage to transform status quo in my home, in my workplace, in society. That courage is very fulfilling. That courage is joy. That courage is going to bed peacefully every single night. So Thank you, Shakti, for opening the door for me.
Thank you, Monica, and thank you, Fritjof. What you just had to share is, and I know having worked with both of you and studied under both of you, is just the tip of the iceberg, and that your work is so much more deeper, and we don't have enough time to get into that. But what we're going to do today, right now, is spend about 40 minutes in a moderated discussion, which I'll lead, and then I'll hand this over to Sylvia and to Sudarshan, who will manage the Q&A. So for those of you who are in our audience today and have a question for either Monica or for Fritjof, please post it in the chat, and one of the two of them, between Sylvia and Sudarshan, they will pick it up and you get a chance to have your question answered. So I'm going to start by asking both of you, Monica and Fritjof, and I know you both of you have expressed the several challenges that we face today. But can each of you, starting with you, Monica, tell me what you see as being your top 3 global challenges? Just if you can stick to the top 3 global challenges, I'd love to hear that from you and then from Fritjof. You're on mute, Monica. We don't hear you.
Yes, all right. The top 3 challenges for me in the world today. The first is identity crisis. So we divide ourselves based on our social identity, rather, what nationality, what religion, whatever. So we divide ourselves that way rather than recognizing the deepest human being in us, our universal values. So it's identity. The second major crisis for me is inequity. And it's driven really by a mindset that, we are living in a world that's a zero-sum game. If I share, then it's scarcity. And it's actually a very deep-rooted part of our survival brain that really moves in a way that is totally irrelevant. So inequity. And then next, the system's rules and the cultural norms that maintain the economic and financial world in a way that's interrelated to every sector, whether that's health and healthful living, education, energy. So somehow today, the way we look at everything is through the lens of money, economics, and finance. We've stopped looking at it in terms of human well-being, planetary well-being, the well-being of every sentient being.
All right, thank you, Monica. Yeah, Fritjof, what do you see as the top 3 challenges today, global challenges?
Well, when you asked, I was preparing myself to say about half of what Monica just said. The main symptoms I would name: climate change, economic inequality, destruction of ecosystems with species extinction. But all these are systemic interrelated problems. And at the root of all of them is an obsession with the illusion that permanent, unlimited economic growth is possible on a finite planet. And as Monica just said, together with that comes an overriding focus on money rather than on well-being of human beings and of the planet. I would like to quote my friend and colleague David Corton here, who has expressed this in a very succinct way. David Corton writes, "We will prosper in the pursuit of life, or we will perish in the pursuit of money. The choice is ours."
Very well said. That was so powerful, Fritjof. Thank you for that. Thank you, Monica. So Fritjof, I'm going to stay with you. You have published as many as 18 books, and your work has evolved considerably. Can you give us an example or two of how you have used systems thinking in your work?
Well, you know, my work is educational. I used to be a theoretical physicist. I did 20 years of research in theoretical physics, and then turned from physics to the life sciences to develop the synthesis of the systems view of life. This is what I write about. This is what I teach. And most recently, as you know, I've developed this online course, which is known as the Capra course. And we have had over 2,000 alumni now around the world. And I'm really impressed by the way that people tell me that this helps them refocus their lives. It helps them to get new perspectives, to apply this systemic thinking to wherever they live, wherever they work. And what is most impressive is that the systems view allows you to use the very same conceptual framework to deal with management and leadership, or health and healthcare, or sustainability, or the COVID pandemic. All these problems and issues can really be addressed with the very same framework, from the knowledge that life organizes itself in networks, and that these networks are inherently regenerative, creative, and intelligent.
All right. Thank you, Fritjof. Monica, it's the same question to you. You know, what does systems thinking mean to you? And can you give us an example of two of how you've used it in your work?
Thank you, Shakti. You know, it's very much the same thinking as Fritjof, but from a different entry point. I trained as a physician. So from day one, I was interacting with people. And then to see what he's talking about in people, to be able to see that actually the people I worked with, whether they were patients or they were community members, thought differently about healing, much more beyond treatment of a problem. They thought about, you know, in many cultures, they think about their body in an interdependent way, not like this is my illness today and I need a medication for it. But I began there and I realized that it was not only the individual, but how we organized health services. And the tools that I use on systems change and system thinking are subject agnostic. And I begin by getting people to stimulate their systems mind, so that irrespective of where they are working, they are able to create sustainable, enduring change in unworkable systems and cultural norms. Now, I know it sounds very big, but so I'll give you two examples of that. And basically the course, Radical Transformational Leadership, includes a major segment, at least a third of the time, is for unfolding self and connecting it to systems change, where we need to see something visibly change and cultural change. So I'll take one on systems and one on culture and take it from different countries. I'll begin with money, because I was working at the Notre Dame Business School, and there was a banker, in charge of a department. And as you and I know that, you know, debt is being pushed down as the way that the so-called people we've marginalized income-wise, we've pushed down debt as the strategy to move things. And so we had a very significant conversation. We know there's data that says in many of the income not so rich countries that you know, women are committing suicide at 9 times the rate because of debt and what it's doing to them. So basically this man thought, he said, I'm going to go back and I'm going to create a new branch that will transform a system that uses debt only as the mechanism of financing change locally. I'm going to change it. And he went and he created a new product line in his bank. And he enrolled people to do that. And that was outstanding. So for me, I'll take you to Ethiopia now. And this was in Puerto Rico. So in Ethiopia, there was a cultural change. And so, you know, in Ethiopia, there are, during the HIV/AIDS epidemic, one of the biggest things was, like in India, there's dowry, in Ethiopia, there's bride price. So basically, culturally, even though laws have changed, they take the property that was generated by the man. His family takes it over. This woman is going through stage 1, learning, and our radical transformational leadership. And she says, you know, I really am a force for equity on the planet. That's what I really care about. I really care about women, men, all genders being equal, all classes being equal. Then she comes back next morning and she said, I have reflected. I've decided, I've talked to my husband. We are going to foster equality. What is this? That in our culture, we take the property that the man has when the man dies, it's going to be returned. And I've already taken action. How great is it? Because nobody clapped for her. Huh? They stood up and said, but that's our culture. She said, if I don't change my culture, who will? That system's change for me.
So, Monica, in March this year, the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, admitted that we are moving backwards in relation to Sustainable Development Goals. And this was an admission that he spoke about this in a press conference, and that the SDGs need to be rescued. What does this tell us of the state of leadership in the world? Your take on this?
My take on this is we've had a crisis. We've had an epidemic, and an epidemic created certain decisions that created change. And, you know, you and I know, Shakti, that during the pandemic, some aspects of human darkness appeared in a way that is unbelievable. There are people who made money at the cost of other people. There are people who violence increased in the homes. Decisions were made that were really not helpful. But let's move beyond that into the larger question of leadership and SDGs. And one of the things he also said is that we need to look at what Fritjof has highlighted, and David Corton highlights many, many times, is what really is the impact of the current processes that we use through corporations and business. It's not just about service delivery. It's also about really understanding the life cycle impacts of these spaces. And then one of the things I know, because I've worked with goals, you know, child rights and goals of survival, I know that the only way we can sustain goals is by deepening the space out of which we strategize. So currently the strategies are very problem-solving oriented. The strategies do not relate to systems change. They do not relate to ethical leadership. So till we change the manner in which we are planning for SDGs, and we intentionally, explicitly use systems change, systems thinking, ethical leadership, and universal values, we are not making it. We can have some sort of superficial kind of assessments, like, you know, even books like Practicalness by Hans Rosling says we are doing much better. But guess what he uses? He uses access data. Access is not utilization. And unless we utilize services, we don't have results. So access itself is a necessary but not sufficient condition for strategic accomplishment of SDGs.
Right. Thank you, Monica. That was very, very insightful. I'm coming back to you, Fritjof. You know, in the past, you have mentioned, you said that the biggest challenge for leaders today is to manage the interplay between formal, well-defined and designed missions and informal networks or communities of practice. Can you please elaborate on this?
Yes, well, underlying this is the question that people in organizations need to ask themselves when they apply a systemic understanding of life. The question is, to what extent is a human organization a living system? And I have struggled with this question for many years, just to ask, is an organization like a business organization a living system? And it took me many years to find out that the answer is yes and no. And it is yes and no because every human organization has a dual nature. It is a social institution designed for a particular purpose. And on the other hand, it is a community of people or several communities of people who work together, who relate to one another, who help one another, who establish informal relationships to make work, enjoyable and meaningful. And so every organization has these communities, contains these communities, which organizational theorists have called communities of practice. These are informal networks, and this is where the aliveness of the organization resides. And the organization as a whole will be alive, and by that I mean will be flexible, adaptable, creative, collectively intelligent. It will be alive to the extent that it recognizes and legitimizes its communities of practice. And so there is an interplay in every organization between design and emergence. Design is part of the formal structures. Emergence is part of the informal networks, and both are needed. The formal structures provide stability and coherence, and the informal structures provide, through emergence, provide creativity, flexibility, adaptability. So the challenge for managers and for leaders is to deal with this tension between the stability of design and the creativity of emergence.
Fritjof, in the management of this interplay, is there an issue also of size of the organization? I remember Schumacher was, wrote his book, Small is Beautiful. So does the size of the organization influence the challenge at hand?
Yes, of course it does. And, if you have a very small organization, then its members will form an informal network, and they will all know each other, and there'll be friendships and alliances. And as the organization grows, if it grows, or in large organizations, you will have several of these informal networks that also interact with one another. So it's as Monica said, it's fractals, and they're networks within networks.
So moving to you, Monica, a lot of your work is in the realm of design. And we just heard Fritjof saying, that there's always tension between the design structures and the emergent structures in an organization. So how do you feel, are these really two paradoxical phenomenon? How do we reconcile them?
Shakti, I would use the word that rather than reconcile, I would use the word how do we generate a complementarity between these two? Because we need both and somehow our thinking has been so fragmented that we look at it as either or, not and. We look at everything as either or, like there's one solution to something. But that's not how it is. There are multiple right answers to so many questions that we have. And so the way in which I have practically practiced design and emergence in my life, so I'll go to that, when I was leading large groups on specific programs, I was very clear that we needed to generate a result. Like if we are working to end the HIV/AIDS epidemic, we need a result. We need some formal systems and structures that enable us to increase testing, to be able to have treatment. Then came the issue in HIV/AIDS. And why am I taking that example? Because it's something that relates to everyone in the world. There are other examples in the world of health and other spaces that relate to particular regions of the world.
Right.
And so there was stigma and discrimination, right? During the early days of the epidemic. Not, in COVID, it wasn't so severe, but in the HIV epidemics, because it was related to sexual behavior, it was very, very severe.
Right.
And so how do I address the emergent space in a human being that allows me to embrace the other differently, to be able to be creative with new solutions? So I did two things. One is I created this knowing that we hold our work with results, because we must generate results. And the other place is who I am, so that I actually see fulfillment in the work that I do. And then the second thing was budgets. So we always, of course, the budget must be used. It's a very practical tool, because where we put our money is what we'll do. And so the budget is, of course, on HIV and AIDS, but too much of the budget was prescribed. So I argued with governments around the world, can you have 20% of the HIV/AIDS budget decentralized and located with individuals who are then allowed to be creative and allowed to have this emergence of what they see? And I think that was so practical. That was so inspiring for them. And then to document their accomplishments differently. If we document it the way we document now, how many, what, the measurable things. No, we documented it as, who were you? How did you transform culture? How did you generate systems change? What were the shifts? What did you shift the culture from to, the system from to, and what did you do? And then we compiled them, and we people who've never ever written anything wrote it and saw it, and 10 years fast forward, people went to that same locality. They were so proud. It was like, yeah. So, there are many examples in the one book, unlike Fritjof, who's written so many books, Fritjof, I've written only one, and that's named Radical Transformational Leadership. And it has over 100 stories of such people.
All right. Shakti, I would like to add to this. If we go to the origin, we go to the origin of HIV, which is the same as the origin of the coronavirus, SARS, and many other recent viruses. The origin is an ecological imbalance, massive intrusion into ecosystems like rainforests and other ecosystems have fragmented these systems and have fractured the web of life. And this is how viruses jumped from animals where they lived in symbiosis and did no harm to humans where they are, toxic and deadly. So if we want to prevent future epidemics, we need to restore ecological balance. That's part of the systemic approach.
Yes, and we talk about that, Fritjof. We discuss that. We design for that change. So we say the mindset that exploits humans is the same as the mindset that exploits everything else. The mindset that regenerates humans is the same as the mindset that regenerates the planet. Absolutely.
Right. So we need to shift from an extractive system to a regenerative system.
Yes.
Yeah, that's incredible. Very, very incredible insight. Thank you, Fritjof. And Monica, I love your statement that life cannot be binary. Yeah, it is anything but binary. Monica, can you, for the benefit of our audience, I'm moving on to the next section of our discussion today on ethics and universal values. Can you quickly, for the benefit of our audience, help us understand, make a distinction between ethics, morality, and universal values?
So the word, I mean, in essence, there is a similar foundation or the same foundation. You know, you can look at universal values, ethics, and morality as the same foundation. But as all words do in life, you know, in the way Fritjof actually began that way. There are hundreds of people who thought systems change, but his systems change is different. So what's different is morality has become a very judgmental space. So we even have a word called immoral, and then we judge other people. And whenever we judge human beings, we generate resistance. That's just the nature of psychology, you know? So the big issue is, how do we look at morality from a very different perspective? Because it's a word that was meant to be ethical. Then in the world of large organizations, and in particular in the world of health, for example, many people use the word interchangeably, morality and ethics. And Peter Singer, who writes a lot on ethics, does that. He uses it interchangeably. But in order that we distinguish individual resilience from an organization that's vibrant and alive, the word ethics is used for standards. It's used for standards in an organization, the rules, the formal side. And the word moral resilience, which is, you know, I work with someone in Johns Hopkins. And so moral resilience is a space where we awaken the self in order to contribute to the ethics. Now, the word ethics has been hijacked by industry. And what ethics, the first time I said, you know, I've never run a large corporation or even a small business. What do they mean by ethics? So I watched their video. What they mean by ethics is, please adhere to the patent laws. And if you break the patent laws, you're unethical. So suddenly the word ethics has been hijacked. Just like the word morality was hijacked a lot by religious fundamentalists and made into that space, ethics has been hijacked by industry. And it's been made into, you're unethical if you break the law. But frankly, we need to, well, maybe I shouldn't say break the law, but Fritjof will be okay with that. Maybe change the law. The word universal values derives from the UN. And the word values I will work with. So when the UN uses the word universal, it means it is applied to everybody everywhere without prejudice, without bias, without saying that person is from that nationality or that person is rich or poor or whatever. So the word universal means that we are able to apply our thinking, our strategies, our actions to every single human being, and in our world now, to every sentient being and the planet. The word values has 5 meanings, depending on whom you're speaking to. So in common parlance, the word values means what I give importance to. In the world of business, when I worked, it means, that means where I make profit in the production of a particular thing. Harvard did a study and found the word that the values around the world actually relate to cultural norms. So if you go to any community and talk about values, we are talking of universal values. They are thinking, what is she saying? Like in my culture, my values say I cover my head, go to an Indian village, and that's what they'll say. You go to the Arab world, our values say we must wear a hijab. So cultural norms are different from values. And we have mixed that up in a way that it actually perpetuates disempowering cultural norms. Then comes the last one, and that's out of a large university like Stanford. And when I was doing my keynote address there, it was very clear to me that what they mean by values is their operational strategy. And what they are saying is our values mean we must have a referral system that is generated from Silicon Valley and the best of tech. That's not a value. That's an operational strategy. So in our work, values are very simple. It is the essence of a human being that will make a courageous decision for systems change that is required for our ecosystem. So it is the space in us as human beings that is self-aware. And according to Daniel Goleman, it's about our own self-esteem, which in society is translated as dignity. It's about our self-esteem. That's the core of why we cover up with dominance and dominating behavior. So that's what it is. Dignity, equity and fairness, and compassion for systems change and action.
Yeah, thank you, Monica. Fritjof, a question for you. Is systems thinking a value neutral place? What do you feel about this?
Well, you can see from what Monica laid out here that all these terms, ethics, morality, and values, have many meanings, and it's quite complicated. And I would like to simplify it by bringing in a scientific perspective from the theory of evolution. When we observe the long history of evolution of life, we discover that nature has sustained life for billions of years by creating and nurturing communities. As soon as the first cells evolved in bacteria, they formed tight networks called bacterial colonies, communities of bacteria. And at every level of life of evolution, nature has created communities. And it turns out that natural selection favors those communities in which individuals act for the benefit of the community as a whole. And in the human realm, we call this ethical behavior. So ethical behavior is always related to community. It is behavior for the common good. Now, in our daily lives, we all belong to many communities, but we all share two communities. We are part of humanity, and we are part of Gaia, the community of life, the living planet. And as such, it behooves us to behave like the other members of the community of life behave. And so this is the grounding of ecological sustainability related to the community of life, and of human dignity and human equity related to humanity. But the thing to remember is that apart from all religion, philosophy, business, and so on, ethics is simply behavior for the common good.
Thank you, Fritjof. You coined it really so well. Yeah, thank you. So I have a follow-on question for you, Fritjof. You were involved in the formation of the Earth Charter, and which comprises of a set of 16 values. So how do we convert that Earth Charter into a living, breathing document? Yeah, so just to give you an example, every time we have a conference of parties, we hear the right things are being said, but ground realities look very different. So how do we get our leaders to move in the right direction? And how do we make the Earth Charter something that's like, so very real?
Well, the Earth Charter is a unique document that embodies those core values that I just mentioned, ecological sustainability and human dignity at all levels of life. And it lays out the various ethical principles. And so what I have done is I have shown the systemic interconnectedness of these 16 principles of the Earth Charter. And I have actually drawn a conceptual map to show this interconnectedness, which I'm happy to make available to anybody, maybe via Sylvia and Gaia Education. But how do we get leaders to embrace the Earth Charter? And that's really more a question for Monica than for me, because that's what her work is all about.
All right. Monica, would you like to quickly comment on this?
Let's begin with some good news. So the good news is that for any group of people, any community, if 10% embrace something, the rest of the community will start embracing it. It's Zai's mathematical model. And I know others have said 15%, like Malcolm Gladwell, and the feminist movement says 5%. But that's first good news. The second good news is that when that happens, people actually have the courage to change something. And so to me, when I hear Fritjof and I hear the questions he raises, I say that this is about awakening self, sourcing one's inner values, to think critically, to make a difference and take action and have decisions that we take at home, in our community, in our workplace. So for me, radical transformational leadership is the way to go.
All right, excellent. Monica, I have one burning question for you. If you could give us your answer in less than a minute so that we can keep to time. You know, you've spoken a lot of universal values, but I want to, take the example of China. The Chinese authorities, have come down very harshly on universal values because they're seen as a Western construct. So is this a norma? Can universal values be, how do we make universal values universal? Your quick take on this, please, Monica.
As long as we don't start using universal values as a way to exclude, punish, highlight the negative dimensions of any culture. In fact, I'm working in the Arab states. One of the professors, I was doing a webinar, said, I find the language of human values far closer to our culture than human rights. And that human rights becomes a space to, like a weapon to look at what's not working. The Chinese culture has a lot of huge, beautiful history. Alan Watts writes about it so beautifully. My sense is, can we tap into that?
All right, excellent. Yeah, I'm going to now wrap up this session today with a question to, to both of you. And in 1 minute each, can you, Monica, and then Fritjof, you, please share your outlook for the future of our planet and our humanity?
When we awaken self and have the courage to change systems, it will work.
All right, lovely. Very, very well said. Fritjof?
Well, this is a question I'm very often asked, and I want to share with you all that I've been very inspired by the answer given by the great statesman Václav Havel, the former president of Czechoslovakia. And here is what, and a major playwright, and here's what Havel writes. He turns this question into a meditation on hope. And he writes the following: the kind of hope that I often think about, I understand above all as a state of mind, not a state of the world. Either we have hope within us or we don't. It is a dimension of the soul, and it is not essentially dependent on some particular observation of the world or estimate of the situation. Hope is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but the certainty that something makes sense, regardless of how it turns out.
Wonderful. Thank you, Fritjof, and thank you, Monica. It's really been a pleasure talking to both of you. Appreciate you taking the time out to be with us today. I'm going to hand this over to Sylvia and Sudarshan, who are now going to manage the Q&A. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Shakti, for guiding us through this conversation. That was very inspiring.
Yes, thank you, Shakti.
Thank you. So we have been collecting quite a few questions. So we may not be able to go through all of them. So Sudarshan and I were going to take turns asking you the questions. So I have a question here from Christian. Christian says, for both Monica and Fritjof, which are the key questions that we have to make ourselves in these times of systemic crisis? So which are the questions that we have to ask ourselves?
Sylvia, will you request one of us to go first? Then it's just easier. I'm waiting for Fritjof, and Fritjof is waiting.
You go ahead, Monica.
You go ahead, Fritjof. Okay, fine. I'll go ahead. All right. So next time you go ahead, that should be your promise, okay? The question I asked myself, and so maybe you could ask yourself, is what is it that bothers me deeply? What do I really care about and want to shift? Because this work, systems thinking, sourcing my values, is subject agnostic. It can be applied to any theme. So the question is, what bothers you? What do you burn for? That's my question I'd ask myself. Fritjof, over to you.
Well, from a systems point of view, you always have to ask, what's the broader context? How are things connected? You know, are there any patterns in these connections that I can observe? That's how I work.
Thank you. Sudarshan, you go with the next question.
Yeah, thank you, Sylvia. We have a question from Jürgen. We create inside out, therefore mindset shifts are the key to system shifts. So how can we be catalysts for mindset shifts towards greater well-being for all? It's not addressed to anybody, but yes.
Well, I think the shift of mindset is what this transition is all about. We have all been raised in educational systems that are fragmented and reductionist. We just think of our academic departments with the separate disciplines, separate journals, you know, separate associations, or, you know, in business, separate departments. And to overcome this and see the connectedness and see the systemic interdependence is a major mind shift. So I think this is where it has to begin.
And I'll just want to add to that and say the missing piece in the binary conversation inside out is this place that we can't see that creates the outside. So there's an inner space in us. And then there is the mindset that's informed by that for interdependence, interconnectedness. And then from that mind comes the action. But unfortunately, we just keep saying inside out. So I get it, there is an outer expression, but in between the deepest inside in us and the mind that is also ours and we cannot see, articulating that differently will be vital to create systems change. Because if we just see inside and outside, we will do what we've continued to do, focus on inside as a separate space, outside as a separate space. But it's not like that. We even measure things differently that way. Inner goals, outer goals. It's not like that. There is that in-between mindset that can be informed either by fragmented ideologies or not so fragmented ideologies, or it can be informed by the greatness of life, of us. So I think articulating the space that Fritjof just brought up separately, constantly, will make us focus on that. So maybe inside, mind, outside, or inside, intermediate. Fritjof, you come up with that.
Yeah.
We hide that space.
Well,
we choose not to look at it. Yeah.
You know, in this advanced view of life, where I mentioned in my introduction that there's a new concept of cognition or a new concept of mind, and it says that there is actually no independently existing outside world. The world that we experience is one that we bring forth in the process of living. And as human beings, we have a coherence because we communicate, and through language, we bring forth our world together. But the world of an insect, or the world of a bird, or the world of a whale is something quite different. So there is no independently existing outside world. It is brought forth in the process of living.
Beautiful.
That would require another hour of discussion.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. And we have other questions, and this is a very interesting question. And for us, who dedicate our, energies and our passions to education. And it says, it's from Claudia, and she says, many of these webinars are usually a preaching to the converted. So many of the people who show up already are interested, and that's why they are here. So the question is, how do we reach others not currently thinking about these systemic thinking topics, in an effective way, in a way that is actually, like you say, Monica, that actually transforms them, is not a superficial level, not at the informational level. So how we reach politicians, researchers, journalists, for example. And I will give it to you, Monica, and then to Fritjof.
Thank you, Sylvia. I'll speak about my practice. To me, a webinar is an inspiring space. It's like the curtain raiser of a play. There must be other strategies to complement this. So what are the other strategies? Some of the strategies are educational, like Gaia Foundation, like the course that Fritjof runs, I run. And so, yes, education is one of them. But one of the most important ways of reaching everyone is having individuals who step up and say, I'm inspired to act. And then to support that person with new thinking, new strategies. So the entry point is not the educational program or the webinar. The entry point is an individual that generates or wants to generate. It's the community of practice. It's the community, then the community of practice. So how do I create platforms for that? So in the work that we do, like Sudarshan and I do, and there are many other colleagues like Sudarshan and Shakti and I do, we create a platform for those who actually want to take this work into the life of researchers, into the life of politicians, into the life of the corporate sector. And to me, it is that emergent awakening of an individual, and then providing the support structure for that individual to move. Because it's very hard to do practical work on the ground alone, because no one's clapping for us, when we are rattling power games, nobody's clapping. How do I create the support structure? In the book, there is one segment called Synergistic Operational Strategies in chapter 6. And in that, there is a specific strategy called supporting risk takers. So one of the things that I cultivate, and I encourage everyone who works with me to cultivate, is how will I support those people who are taking the risk to change the situation? Because all of this is maintained, either vested interest or the sense of power over people or power over something. And, in Buddhism, it would be called simple ignorance. And so for me, supporting risk takers, very, very vital. Yeah.
So Claudia asked this question, which is a very important one. And I can tell you that I decided a long time ago in my work to try and create communities of systemic thinkers and activists by offering my books and my course and my seminars. And it is true that the people who are attracted to them, will share our basic values already, but they're still very confused, many of them. And what I can do is bring conceptual clarity into their confusion, so that when they go out and apply the systems approach, they will be more powerful because of this greater clarity. And that's how I'm working.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So we have time for one more question, Sudarshan,
Yeah.
maybe two.
Yeah.
And then we're going to be closing. Go ahead, please.
Yeah. Thank you, Sylvia. Here's an interesting question. So it's from Michelle. She says, if life is also a communication system, the media and the language we use is also relevant. There are a big number of languages in nature, also for humans, from mathematics to music to art. But most of the time we use words. So what are the creative languages in your perspective? And that could help radical transformative leadership, because we create our world with languages. So can create or destroy life with language.
Yes, and this is why I'm very excited about the language I sort of discovered very recently to summarize the systems view of life, because these terms that life is inherently regenerative, creative, and intelligent, they are common terms that are easily understood. And what is more, they're very evocative. And so I hope that people can use them, before going into the technical details, can use these very evocative terms to promote a life-affirming language.
So thank you. And to me, an additional dimension of this is to demystify language. Because technical people use very, systems thinkers, unlike Fritjof, it's not accessible, it's so complex. In my world, we have several groups that in addition to the language we use for radical transformational leadership, we have several groups that are integrating this. So one such group we call RTL Arts. In fact, I just finished last weekend a work with them. They are all artists. They are either singers or dancers or musicians. And we expose them to the foundational components of radical transformational leadership. And they rewrite song, dance. We did the same when we worked. I did the same, working with musicians, artists, theater people, exposing them to these tools and allowing their creativity and talent to create new songs. For example, the Tigrian woman who got up and created a song, apparently they sing, that women need to be in the field and at home. And working through this, she created a rap song that was totally different, or a hip hop song that's different. Okay, so that's the arts. We have a group called RTL Tech. And that group, they are geeks. They are like either software designers, or they are implementing STEM education, or they are engineers, or they are hardware people. And they are about integrating and transforming some of the spaces that the world of technology now, the language they use is used. There is another group that works on animal rights, RTL Animal Welfare. And that's about being able to integrate this into a different world that you and I don't even have really. I mean, someone like Fritjof knows much more. It's a different world. There's one on mental health and well-being that includes people who have mental illness as well. And so it's another world. And so for me, thank you for bringing that up, because our worlds are different, but there is something core in our world. There's a fractal in that world. That pattern is everyone in every world has that inner space, has a way of thinking systems, changing culture and norms, and they all want to contribute. There's something in us that wants us to contribute to life. And just awakening that space of I want to give. It's innate in us till we shut it down and tell them, no, if you give, you'll have too little. Yeah.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you. I think that relates a lot with one of the principles that Fritjof said at the beginning, that life is inherently, creative. So we want to give, we want to create. So, and we want to connect with networks as well. Well, thank you all. We are approaching the end of the webinar. It has been a very informative, but also very transformative webinar, because it was not just about information, it was about passion, about the passion the two of you have put in your lives, with transforming those around you, with transforming yourselves, with inspiring everybody. And I'm really, really grateful that you presented together today. So as a way of closing this amazing webinar, do you have a couple of words or a sentence that you want to share with everybody, specifically people who are young and who are looking towards, a very challenging world these days? What would be your message to them? And Monica, you can go ahead, and then Fritjof.
Unfold your full potential and passion for life.
Thank you.
I would like to add a word about the importance of community. I mentioned before that nature sustains life by creating and nurturing communities. And this transformation that we are talking about is most effectively achieved in learning communities. Because in learning communities, when you discuss conceptual relationships, you experience human relationships at the same time, which brings an emotional component into it that is very powerful. So Gaia Education is a learning community. RTL are several learning communities. The Capra course is a learning community. So I wish you all that you participate in those and many other learning communities.
Thank you, Fritjof. Shakti or Sudarshan, do you want to add anything before we close?
I just wanted to circle back to what I said right at the very beginning, that it's never too late in life to learn. And I am learning something or the other, everything new daily. And it's a really exciting period in my life.
Thank you.
Yeah, just wanted to say that since the word catalyst was used earlier, catalyst is someone who changes everything in chemistry. It changes everything, but not change themselves. So be the change you wish to see. Source your full potential to change systems and culture.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody. I invite you all to put a word in the chat of, how you're leaving the webinar, and a commitment to yourself and a commitment to your communities and to the world. So thank you all for showing up, which is the first step, showing up with your care. Thank you.
And thank you, Sylvia.
Thank you,
Thank
Sylvia.
you so much.
Thank you, Sylvia.
Yeah.
Thank you, Fritjof. Thank you, Monica.
Yeah,
thank
thank
you.
you, Fritjof.
Thank you, Sylvia.
Thank you, Shakti.
Thank you, Sudarshan. Yeah.
And
Thank you.
everyone.
Everyone.
Thank you all.